Welcome everyone dearly to our first, this year, first ELOC seminar, and we have a wonderful, truly wonderful speaker this time. But before that, I'm going to tell you just quickly about the schedule and how this will be working. So we will have first Patricia's, or actually I'm opening this one now and then introducing our speaker. And then we will have about 45-minute presentation by Patricia Alexander. And after that, Erno and Patricia will have a very stimulating discussion about the topic of the talk. And after this, there will be a moment when if you don't want to hang around and have a small group discussions with us, then it's a good time to leave us and say bye-bye, because then I will be sharing us into a breakout rooms, and then we can start discussing about two specific questions that Patricia has prepared for us. And after these small group discussions, we'll come back to hear Jake's last words and some kind of probably a very brief summary of the session today. So this is the plan, and then this is what we have had so far. I want to remind you that all the presentations are in YouTube in our ELOC. You can get there in YouTube directly or by our ELOC web pages. And today we are going to hear a presentation by Patricia. And I may start her introduction by numbers, of course. We have this tradition of looking at some numbers, and I found really big numbers from Patricia. So in Scopus, she has more than 7,000 citations, which is crazy, and nearly 200 articles there. This means that actually her papers are very, very highly cited papers. Also, what I read from those, very many, huge number of co-authors. And then the words, like when we decided that we will ask if Patricia wants to join us in the ELOC, I had a kind of my first memory of you, Patricia, is from around 20 years ago or so, when I heard Maria Vauras saying like, well, we have this, Patricia is kind of talking about this metacognition and reading comprehension and those kinds of things. And we all were in Center for Learning Research. We were really excited about your work, and we were admiring the comprehensiveness and the educational nature of it. But maybe the first thing that comes into the mind when we think about you, and all of us when we think about you, is that you are always such lovely present person. When you enter the room, we notice that you are there, and you take your audience in such a wonderful way that I don't know anyone else who is so good at doing that. I looked at what kind of accomplishments you've got, and there are just like very many beautiful big awards. So Patricia is one of the big names in our field in educational sciences. So it is a huge honor that we got you to join us here. So thank you for coming. And when I look at your career and what kind of research projects and educational projects you have been working on, I see your open-mindedness in there. Like you have been doing work on both reading and writing and strategies and motivation and metacognition, and nowadays also, like what we love, that you started to look at also mathematics learning, and especially spontaneous focusing on mathematical aspects. That's like a dream come true, that such a wonderful person and a great researcher in the world starts to working on something that excites us very much too. So maybe the last word is educational. So you have been such a role model in education, in the research of education, and also for us um, from last 20 years, like in the educational research field, like how you do your research, how you educate others, how you promote younger scholars in the field, and how you put your research into educational packages and how you deliver the message in your talks. It's truly educational, and that's why it's so great also to have you in ELOC here.
Well, thank you. And what wonderful, wonderful introduction that was. It was personal and it was exaggerated, but I loved it. Anyway, so thank you for that. I really do appreciate it. And let me begin by, as I said, thanking you for the invitation. This meant a lot to me. I would never think about saying no to such an invitation. Having spent time with the group, I know how much you are committed to research of high quality and to making a difference in students' lives, all of you. And for that alone, I would be present. But the fact that we're honoring Erno makes it all the more important that I am here. So let me get started. The title may be a bit confusing, but hopefully I can unwrap it for you. So I really am going to look at this issue of what patterns bring to us as educators and educational researchers in a number of fields, and tie it to the issue of thinking and reasoning, which have always been of importance to me, as we'll see. And I do think there are implications I want to make sure I get to in this for us to talk about, which I think are deeply rooted concerns that I have about the education of people around the world of all ages. I love this quote by Alfred North Whitehead. It explains me in so many different ways. If I have been successful as an educational researcher, it's not because I seek out these amazingly powerful notions that, like grand unification theory. It's because I have, in my life, noticed that the things we step over educationally and in research become extremely important. Those things that other people just don't pay any attention to are those small ideas, like the patterns that I'm going to talk about today, then become my focus. Why is it we don't define terminology? Why is it that we don't look at students' responses and understand that they're not just noise in the data? They are really powerful pieces of information. So for some of you, wherever you are in your career, I would say to you, sometimes the smallest ideas have the most power. The ideas that other people have just simply taken for granted or not paid attention to is what can be extremely important. It also explains that I do have an odd mind, as Alfred Whitehead said. So what I'm going to do is going to start out by clarifying terms for you. As I said, I've made a good amount of my most highly cited publications deal with what do we mean by this idea or this construct. So I want to make sure I clarify my key terms for you. And I'm going to justify then why I think this issue of patterns is so very important for all of us, not just the people in math ed or people in literacy, but I think for cross disciplines and domains. And then I want to talk about what I think it takes to be good at finding or noticing patterns, and also to trying to find an explanation for those patterns. And then I'm going to bring you to how this ties into some of what I'm doing right now with relational thinking and relational reasoning. As I said to you, I really do want to deal with these implications of this, and then turn a bit to some future directions that we can think about as a field. A big agenda for 45 minutes. So let me start with my clarifying terms. And the first one I want to clarify is what I mean by a pattern. Patterns are these regularities. We have them all around us. They're predictable repetitions, they're iterations of events or objects or experiences that we have. Now, these occur in nature. I have been for many years fascinated by things like fractals. I read and studied a lot on chaos theory or systems theory, because I think this all speaks to the notions of patterns at a grander scale. And not only do these patterns occur everywhere in nature, but they occur in such a way that we can physically try to represent them as Charles Peirce talks about. In other words, in math, whether it's math, it's science, it's literacy, it's writing and reading, we tend to want to try to reproduce those patterns that we see in life, in our disciplines or fields. But patterns can exist solely in the mind. That's just what perceptions are. It's not what is, it's what we think is, or what we perceive to be the case. And I think that's important for many of our areas of research as well. So these patterns don't have to be true. They can be human mental creations of a sort. But that's what patterns are. And I hope that simple explanation helps. Now, what I began to find in my own teaching, I've been teaching now for over 60 years, in some form. And in that teaching, I find that the notion of patterns, not that I had the sophisticated notion long ago, but I see it ties to the ability of students to think and to reason. So what do I mean by those terms? And I do think the distinction has some merit to us. They're both about mental or cognitive operations. When we are thinking or whether we're reasoning, we are using our mind and the abilities of our minds in many different ways. Now, thinking is a broader term when I use it. It means all range of mental activities. That means it can be, I just put here conscious or unconscious, but it can be flawed, it can be accurate, it can be domain specific, it can be general. Thinking is the activity of the human mind, all right? But when we talk about reasoning, there's one more characteristic of it I think that we have to take into consideration. When you reason, there's an intentionality to it. There's a conscious effort put into this idea of producing an idea or reflecting on a thought. Reasoning carries more cognitive demands to it than does the general notion of thinking. Both are necessary, both work together, and both are important. Now, why did I decide to talk to you about patterns? What do I think is important about them? To begin with, patterns, as I said at the outset, are found throughout nature. The world, the universe, the human mind, or the smallest atom, all operate in some sort of predictable regulatory way. That doesn't mean there aren't variations, they're not iterations, but without patterns, there's no way we could conduct research on any form, because there would be nothing that we could begin to predict. There's nothing that we could anticipate. And this goes to all forms of human action as well. I remember what made me good as a teacher is that I was able very quickly on, one of my gifts was be able to look at a classroom of my students, and from the smallest little motion or action or words that they might speak, I realized that that student was in that moment in time an anomaly to their pattern. They were behaving differently than they would under other circumstances. The small triggers tell you that when patterns show some sort of disruption, some sort of effect, it affects the entire system. And so they exist everywhere, and that they're all levels of magnitude. And this is the important thing to remember. Whether you're a microbiologist or you study the universe, you're a theoretical physicist, you are dealing with patterns, but those patterns exist at all levels of magnitude. And because of that, the methods that we have to apply to them become varied, right? It makes a difference if you're studying the structure of the COVID, the virus itself, or you're studying something like the complexities of a school environment that has so many factors working in a systematic sort of way. But all of science, this is my argument, involves a search for the patterns. What those patterns are, of course, differ. And we then set out to try to explain those patterns as we see them. That's what our sciences are. And I think what separates academic disciplines, and also in my estimation, brings them together, is this idea that every discipline has its own set of particular kinds of patterns that it values more than others. And it's about the search for an understanding of those particular patterns in mathematics, for example, the patterns in language production that really help us understand what pulls us to that discipline. But because we have this shared root of patterns, you can find threads that carry from one discipline in school, academic discipline, to another if you search for them. And that's because I think all of learning, just like all of science, involves some sort of perception of those patterns, or apperceptions, what we do with them in our heads and how we pull them into our mental frameworks. And it also involves our use of our application of those patterns. That's what makes us successful as learners. Okay. Now, what does it take to discover patterns or to explain them? What are those things that we should be valuing or promoting that would promote in individual students or in groups of individuals this idea of pattern discovery and pattern explanation? And for that, I'm not going to give you an answer. I'm going to provide you what William James wrote in his briefer course, and I'll read it to you in my professional voice as we laugh about it. It is obvious that all advance in knowledge must consist of both discrimination and association. For in the course of our education, objects appearing separately are brought together and appear as new compound wholes in the mind. Analysis and synthesis are thus the incessantly altering mental activities, a stroke of one preparing the way for the stroke of the other. This was a piece of brilliance that William James wrote in 1893, an amazing piece. So he gives us the route to the answer. So what does it take to discover and to explain patterns? Well, it requires an ability to associate, to see things as connected in some sort of way. But arm in arm with that, and I'm going to talk about why this is important, arm in arm with that, you must be able to discriminate. And a lot of what I'll talk about is that we put a lot of stress on how are things going together, but we don't talk about the subtle differences that exist. And those subtle differences are like the shadows in a painting. They're as important as the light areas. Dark and light work together all the time to allow one to see in a more refined sense what one wants to understand. And yet we don't do a lot with the discrimination that I think we should. But then once you've done this association discrimination, you have to step back and analyze what you have. You have to really take it apart, reflect on it in so many different ways, even as you also at times pull it together. This idea of, I often think of the Laviscon, the infinity symbol, as really a dance between analysis and synthesis. You're not doing one in isolation from the other. They really move together all the time. It's a continuous sort of motion involved. And again, the one that James didn't mention about, but he has a whole chapter on, is this idea of perception. What is it you're able to notice, to grab hold of in whatever situation you happen to be in? And perception is a key element that is, again, often overlooked. Not in spontaneous focusing. In many ways, you care a great deal about what people glom onto very quickly, but it's not necessarily a major part of curricular activity. All right, if I go too fast, hold your hand up or scream at me and I'll slow down. But anyway, all right, so let's go to this idea of, now I want to make a bit of a leap, but it is a connected leap to the research that I've been doing now for at least aggressively for the last decade or a little over a decade. And this idea of relational thinking and relational reasoning. And it goes back to what I want my students to do, what I want my doctoral students to do, or my undergraduates to do. And if I were back teaching 4th and 5th grade, I would do it there too. Is I want them to see knowledge as not in pieces. I don't want them to become people who walk around with what Whitehead would call inert knowledge. I want them to begin to see that whatever they pick up in learning today connects in some sort of meaningful way to what they have learned the day before, the year before, outside of the classroom. This idea of connectedness to me is what makes somebody a knowledge builder. It makes them capable of holding on to ideas and letting them grow and become a fuel to their performance. So that's why I started turning to this idea of relational thinking and relational reasoning. This diagram is a bit complex, but all I want to point out to you is the following. I make a distinction between relational thinking and relational reasoning. It parallels what I said to you that I see differently between thinking and reasoning. That is that we're always engaged in this sort of this consolidation of information. Sometimes it's unconscious, it's instantaneous. It's like when I walk out of this in my house and I go to pick up the paper this morning, there's a little creature that happened to hop by as I was picking up the newspaper at 5 in the morning. And what I was able to do, I didn't think about it. I didn't ask myself, yeah, what is that thing? How do I understand what that thing was? It instantaneously struck me as if what I was looking at was a rabbit, a little bunny, baby bunny hopping along, right? All the time, we don't stop and analyze every object in our environment or question every word we hear. Most of the time, we simply pick it up. In other words, we are perceptive. We grab hold of it in the moment that it is presented. And there's a big divide in the theoretical literature between this idea of immediacy, the presentation of something in the moment, alive and active, and this representation, how we bring it into the mind, how we use it later or pull it back out. And what relational thinking is all about is building on the notion of percept. How good you are at noticing in the moment, how quickly in that moment you can see associations between things that it occurs in milliseconds, if you will. It's involuntary, it's really not reflective at all. It is really part of who we are as humans. It's part of our functioning that could be honed and improved, granted, but it's the natural part of being human. Now, that's where relational thinking is so important. But where we put the emphasis instructionally is on the other side of that model. It's this idea of concepts. Percepts, how do I put it? The percepts and concepts are always interacting all the time. What we're bringing in, what we're putting out from our minds, right? These things must always work in conjunction for learning and all things that we care about to work effectively. But concepts are those representations, to use Peirce's way of saying it, that exist inside our heads and how we can power them and use them. And it is through relational reasoning that we can maximize what it is we have perceived. We can, in a sense, build richer and more enduring and more principled ideas inside our head that are connected to other things. I tell my students, my undergraduates all the time, when I say something to you, the first thing you should do is try to figure out what it links to that you already have experienced, you know. That's part of the process in a simple way of thinking relationally. It is much more of, it can be part of it involuntary, but we really put an onus on intentionality and purpose. And spontaneous focusing, as I read it, has much more to do with the percept side of the things that the math and group in Finland at Turku are working on. But they too carry it over to the reflection side of it in a very meaningful sort of way. All right. So let me do a simple contrast between relational reasoning and relational thinking. So its nature is one in relational thinking is presentation, the in the moment. Whereas for relational reasoning, you're really dealing with much more of the representation side. The locus in mundi, if I say my Latin correctly from my years of Latin training in Catholic school, it's really in the world. It's out there. It's in the physical environment where it's in the mind in terms of relational reasoning. Currently, there's a lot of interest in system 1, system 2 thinking, and that's another way to add that to our complex. Relational thinking is reactive. It's really just our responsiveness to our sensing of things. Whereas when you get to relational reasoning, you're calling up the reflective system 2 processing. The time frame for relational thinking is in the moment. It's immediate. Whereas relational reasoning, you can continue to build your understandings relationally over time, over context, over disciplines. That's the beauty of it. So in relational thinking, the only justification you require is what you feel or you sense. That's all that's required. But when you get into engaging yourself in relational reasoning, you're looking for justifications, for examination, and for analysis. Okay. Now, here's where my research has kind of opened the field a bit, for better or worse. One of the things that is always I talk about a lot, as you're going to see, is this idea that we have focused most of our energies on similarity-based reasoning. That is analogical reasoning. How is it like B, sort of thing? And there's nothing wrong with that. We're going to talk about analogical reasoning as a gateway reasoning process. You need that. Before you can analyze something, you have to pick it up quickly and see it as related to something else. But it's by no means all that's necessary. There are at least 3 forms of dissimilarity-based reasoning. And a lot of this comes from math set theory, actually. It's mathematicians who often did a lot of this philosophical reasoning for us. And they talk about anomalous reasoning. And I'll define each of these as I go through. Antinomous reasoning and antithetical reasoning. Let me explain. Again, analogies is probably the one that most people have heard of in some fashion. Schools sometimes deal with it, though not well. And that is that you're looking for attributional similarities. And it can't just be one common or one pairing that you notice. To be reasoning analogically, you have to find multiple attributes, multiple similarities across whatever it is you are comparing and contrasting. So it's all about things that look on the surface to be unrelated, but you build bridges to that other thing by looking at attributional similarities. I created this one for you to think about. In what way is a classic analogy problem similar to a ratio problem in mathematics, for example? That's a meta-analogical reasoning, because each of those separately are examples of analogies, but you are trying to, in your mind, building a meta-analogy. How are these two things alike? And to give you some, not to answer the question for you in detail because of time, but analogies are important, and where people falter in their analogical reasoning is that the two sides must be as completely balanced as possible, right? One attribute deviation can set the analogy off kilter and make it less appropriate. And so just like in a ratio problem, there's an exactitude to it in a sort that we have to think about. It's like a scale balance, and any deviation from the answer, and this is I wouldn't make you answer this one, because my American students have never, my undergraduates, not one of them in over 8 years has ever gotten this one right. So that's just to tell you before they learn how to do them. The answer to herd is to cow, as flock is ewe, E-W-E, which is a female sheep, because they often say things like sheep, but sheep is plural. It's a collective, whereas cow is singular. So that one deviation alone makes the answer less than perfect. Okay. Now let's talk about the ones that you may know less about. In science, anomalous reasoning is extremely important, because anomalous reasoning is looking at a set. Now, the objects have to belong to a set. This is where set theory comes into place. But within that set of things, identifiable as some element, there's an exceptionality that you notice. There is a bit of a discrepancy that you notice, or an outlier. We do this all the time when we clean data sets, for example. The data belong to the same experiment. They're part of a set, but we often find that you have one person where everybody else took 15 minutes to do your task. One person took 2 hours, right? And if that person was brought into the data set, we have to decide, does it distort the patterns? Is it that anomalous that it distorts? Or is it something we want to keep because it has meaning? And in science, if these anomalies can themselves follow patterns, you see, and that's why you decide that Pluto, for example, this year is not a planet, where next year, who knows, right? Because the data The anomalous data have some degree of consistency and explanation to them that you don't want to discard. All right. The next two, particularly this term, is one that people rarely know, but its distinction to the next term are part of what I call the more refined side of relational reasoning. Antinomy is an ontological distinction. And what I mean by that is you can't put them together. If you have something that's truly antinomous to something else, it's an exclusion. It either fits or it doesn't fit. There's nothing between them. There's no variations. It belongs in box A or it doesn't, period. It belongs in box B or it doesn't, period. It's where judgments are that definitive. And some little examples we find in children's science textbooks or math textbooks would be, does this object sink or float? Okay, there's no ifs there. It's no gray areas. The thing either goes in the box that says float or sink, right? The same thing with things like prime and composite numbers. What is a prime number? That's not saying, what, can you talk to me about the gray areas of prime? Now, maybe if you're a math theorist, you can come up with something, but most of us are not math theorists. So I hope that makes sense. It's an either or situation. Now, the thing to know is in the sciences, these things exist. They are almost non-existent in many of the social sciences. There's no purity of judgment. There's nothing we can label for something to be clearly X or Y, but yet we use them all the time, which I'll talk about. We create these false dichotomies. The other side of it is, and the one that gets confused with people, is antithetical reasoning. Now, with antithetical reasoning, you're comparing opposing points, right? But between those opposing points, think about it as a continuum. Between those opposing points are infinite number of possibilities that can exist between them. It's a continuum. It's not a dichotomy. And I hope at this time of morning for me or for you, it's not going to be completely crazy what I'm saying. But think about this. If I ask you to think about all the words you can think of that fall between these points of diminutive and colossal, what other levels of this continuum can you name? And what is that continuum? What are we really comparing when we put diminutive at one end and colossal at another? Of course, it has to do with size. Here's an example of an antithetical problem that would be part of a word reasoning task. And you can see that what the person has to do is read the sentence carefully. Because of the favorable winds, the sailboat made great time across the lake. Now, what they have to do is find which of those sentences is the most clearly at the other end. It reverses these key characteristics that are part of the sentence. And I'm not, because of time, if you're brilliant and you can read it, I'll make sure Mina has the slides. So any of you are welcome to my slides, by the way. Okay. So those are the four: analogy, antinomy, antithesis, and an anomaly. Did I say anomaly twice? Who knows? I think a sip of coffee, that'll help. Wait a minute. So let me take this idea of patterns, thinking, and reasoning, and let me get to what I consider to be critical implications about them. Now, I'm going to put my neck out for some of these. But at my age, who's gonna like, they can challenge me, right? Or no, but it's gonna be interesting. Anyway, here's what I believe are some implications. Ideas are outcomes that are not simply black or white, right or wrong, good or bad, are continually treated as such in our classroom materials, in the way that I hear people teach. It drives me crazy. So, for example, in our research, very often you hear people go, let's classify somebody as a good teacher or a bad teacher, or let's talk about this as being an answer on a test as being clearly right, and the other side of it, as I'll talk about in a minute, is clearly wrong. Well, life doesn't present itself that way. There are every variation of better teachers or worse teachers, but you can't simply throw people into categorical boxes and call them good or bad. We do it sometimes when we make simple, we overstate things in its simplicity. And let me say that from a developmental psychological standpoint, I understand why we do this in part when children are extremely young. Children who are extremely young can't necessarily deal with the points between the things very easily, right? They want to know, did I do this right or did I do this, is this not right? They deal much more in simplistic terminologies because that's their young minds. That's cognitively and developmentally where they are. But that should not be the only way things are taught. And we can find ways to introduce grays in all that we teach as we move forward. And I see it all the time, even among these people who I regard as highly effective teachers. They'll say, here are the 3 explanations for X, right? Well, where in the world did it say there are only these 3? That doesn't. But we cast things in such definitive terminology that it does damage to students' abilities to think about the subtleties, to think about those discriminations that I told you about in the way. And in the special issue that Jake and Mina put together on spontaneous focusing, one of our contributions was to talk about error analysis. And I know that that in part, because of philosophy, some people don't like to think of errors at all. But you have to understand in classical true score theory, you have the right and everything else is considered noise, right? It's either the right answer or noise. But I always tell my students, never fail to say what you think, because even if you are not wholly correct, what you tell me gives me more insights into and how to improve your thinking, or how the class I can teach it differently. Because the idea is, rarely in our life do we answer with perfection about anything. I don't care what it is. And so that we have to stop thinking about error, as it does in measurement theory, as merely as all error being first randomly produced, which I'll talk about in a moment, and then valueless. When students produce incorrect answers, it is rare, absolutely rare, when that incorrect answer is produced as a random act. In other words, thought, contemplation went into the production of that answer by them most often, which means there's something worthwhile. It's certainly not random. It follows patterns. And that, again, leads us back to the notion of patterns. I find that the kind of errors my students make have a certain pattern to them that gives me insight in what I need to do to help them improve their understanding. There's absolute value in error if we know how to make use of it. There's also so much that's thrown at students. And as I said, under this COVID and this teaching by virtual that's going on right now, a lot of this has been exacerbated. But that everything is chop, 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 move, move, move. Let's get through this. Let's get through this. That we throw so much at students that they are overwhelmed by what we give them, and they have no time. They're not rewarded for stepping back and having time to contemplate what it is they have heard, what they think they've come to understand. The only way to achieve this relationship that I'm talking to you about patterns and thinking and reasoning, is that we have a chance to open up the space and to play with ideas. And I've seen some wonderful literacy educators and math educators do this naturally. They give them an idea, but they don't teach it as just memorize this thing, get it inside your head and move on. It's, why do you think that's the case? Why does this happen? And that kind of opening up the space is going to grow the mind of students in ways that are being overlooked right now in the educational system. Also, I want to say that we've got to start giving instructional time and space to ideas about perception, about thinking and reasoning. That we take it for granted, if we teach content, these will result. And they do not result optimally. Yeah, something will happen. Students will gain some notion of perception, and they're human. Perception is part of being human, but we don't teach them how to maximize that process or ability. Of course they think. It's the nature of the beast, and they can engage in reasoning and do, but we don't help them grow that ability. And that's as much of our responsibility as to teach the facts and the concepts and the procedures that are part of our disciplines. The other side of it is, not surprisingly, is that there is almost a vacuum when it comes to the explicit teaching of relational reasoning processes. And I don't mean to do these in isolation. They should be done naturally as the opportunity occurs. But you also need to teach them the language of reasoning, because as what we know from Vygotsky and others, the more that you have words to explain, the easier it is for you to contemplate. It gives a focal point to the reasoning. All right. Let me, in the time I have left, which is a couple minutes, go now to what I consider to be the recommendations I'm going to put forward, both instructionally and research. The first thing is we have to be, all of us should be alert to this propagation of false dichotomies. We divide the world into two pieces too often and too simplistically. We see it right now in the US with the crap that's going on politically. It's so distressing that people can only think in these simplistic sort of terms and not understand one another as a consequence. But we are contributors to the process as educational researchers and as teachers. We must stop doing that. Be alert to your tendency to create false dichotomies. And I also want us to begin in our own assessments, and those of us who actually create measures and assessments, to think beyond the simplistic yes, no, right, wrong answers. We do it in part, even if we do multiple choice, by creating what we call graduated response options, each one showing a different level of understanding, so that if you don't get the perfectly correct response, I can learn from the error patterns that you make. And that's something we can do as people who have that ability. And you know, our assessment is part of our tools and all that we do. Simply allocate more time to reflection of key ideas. Now that means you can't continue to throw content at students at a mile a minute. You have to make choices about teaching more about less. And that's a very, very strong recommendation I would make to education and the preparation of teachers. What is the most critical concepts and processes that need to be known for a particular content domain that I'm teaching? And then make sure that that is played with in so many different ways, that that time is devoted to those constructs, and then they can be built upon. You can thread them through. You can show how those ideas grow over time. And learn to, as teachers, questioning is part of what we do in a very meaningful sort of way. And what we have to do is learn not to ask factoid type questions that go nowhere, right? These textbook kinds of questions that are worthless as instructional tools. We should ask questions that require a critical analytic response that doesn't have always a simple answer, and that we're not playing the game of you can guess what I want you to say game that goes on so often in classroom. Questioning is a core part of the instructional pedagogical process, and it has to be used in a much better way. The other thing I do simply, but it has a strong impact in my own teaching, is that whenever I present a concept or procedure that's new, I immediately juxtapose it, put it up against something else they have been taught. It can be something that contrasts strongly. It can be something that has a lot of shared components to it. But then I make them talk about what's similar or different about these two. How do these fit together? How do they not fit together? Because I don't want them to think about ideas in isolation. And then I want to make sure that I talk about, when I teach something instructionally, I want to tie it to something that's existed before, that I think they have experienced before. Always create these ties, these temporal ties, so that you're not always living in the moment and teaching in that frame as if it's isolated in a moment. Okay, I think that's, And of course, use the language of relational reasoning in your teaching. Talk about words like antinomy, talk about words like anomalies, all those sorts of things that give students the power of the language. And finally, future research. We have to do more in situ studies of relational reasoning as it unfolds. Observation studies in classrooms. We've watched and taped doctors, a set of doctors making diagnosis. We've looked at engineers solving a problem as a collective. We've looked at these things as they are unfolding to see where relational reasoning has a critical role to play in the performance of everyday natural tasks. And it also becomes the basis for transfer. We always wonder why transfer is such a hard thing to achieve. It's because the system works against it, very simply. There's very little of the kind of stuff that I talked about that would make people begin to think about transfer as a natural flow. We have only started on this, but we need to start seeing what happens when we do intervention studies where we train these relational reasoning process and what the outcome is over time. And then questioning. Effective questioning is something that teachers need to be taught. There's a group of individuals, Catherine Snow, Kieran Murphy, and others who are doing these studies of better questioning strategies that lead to better reasoning. So those are my directions. So I want to thank, again, the Mathematics and Learning Research Group for putting their necks out and inviting me to do this. Thank you all for all your help and for the time I spent with you. But of course, I want to most say thank you to Erno. And I want to pay tribute to him because he is, as we all know, an exceptional scholar. I have watched him. He's an inspiring teacher to work with. He has been transformational in the field as a leader. And to that, I thank him. And looking at his students as I have, I know he's an outstanding mentor. He has helped to grow the next generation of scholars. Those of us who collaborate with him know he's a great collaborator. He will give all that he has to the collaboration, but most of all because he's a friend. So thank you, Erno, and thank you all.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for the excellent presentation and of course the very, very kind words at the end of your presentation. I very much appreciate it, and I could say exactly the same about you. Summarized in your last slide. But the idea of this whole model, what Minna and Jake has developed, is that now after the presentations we have a discussion. And in your presentation you had so many interesting topics that of course we only can deal with a few of them. But I would start with the very kind of general topic, and then we can go more to the educational issues. But you made a very interesting comment when you were talking about the patterns which cannot put together this, which are ontologically refer to ontological differences.
Right.
And then you commented that that's important in science, but in natural science, but we very seldom have that in this form in social and behavioral sciences. And I think that that's an extremely important point. And it's related to a problem I have noticed for example, in learning research, that there's one reason for the lack of accumulation of knowledge is that people in learning research and behavioral sciences, they like so much the concept of scientific revolutions and paradigm shifts coming from natural sciences. Right. And then when they introduce something new, they immediately try to claim that this is now the new paradigm. The old paradigms are completely wrong. And for my reasons, it's a serious problem in learning research and in behavioral sciences in general. Because I completely agree with you that we very seldom have in social sciences situations where things are completely different ontology.
That's right. That's right. Well, let me respond. And I think you and I should write about this at some point in time, because it is an extremely critical issue as senior, meaning age scholars in the field. We've seen these paradigmatic shifts, as they call them, recycle and recycle and recycle, which means there is no such thing as a true paradigmatic shift. Even Kuhn, who wrote that piece, wrote a later piece saying he was wrong, but we never cite his follow-up piece where he backed off of that claim. And the reason is this: let's be honest. What is it that gets you noticed is revolution, is throwing your hands up and saying, for example, that there's no truth in mathematics, that whatever you conceive of it to be, it is. You know what I mean? Like the radical constructivists, they had to go radical, as Ernst wrote about and talked about. You had to go radical constructivist to get attention. What gets attention is loud, it's flashy, but it's not truth, okay? And for those of us who understand that change should never be, you never throw something out completely and replace it, because you can tell right from the beginning that when that occurs, the end result is you will not achieve the goal, right? The goal lies in logic between the two. That's where it lies. What is good about, like, let me give a simple example. Behaviorism. If you asked an educational psychologist these days, or an educational scientist, what their philosophical frame is, you will find few that would ever claim to be behaviorists. And yet behaviorism lives in schools. It functions in schools. It is part of cognitive behavioral work that's done with special populations, for example. But you can't give credit where it's due. And that's a sad state of affairs for us. Because if we really want to make change that's dramatic, we have to take what works for whom, under what conditions, and understand that and build on it. And that's where the problem lies. The other side of it, Erno, is that it's too hard to talk about the complexities. What works for whom, under what conditions, is really what we want to understand. So, but what we do is we create these global interventions, these global proclamations that are supposed to work for all people, all students, all learners. And by nature, it cannot.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So I completely agree what you say, and your example about behaviorism is very good, because we still see that the behaviorist studies are the strongest ways to explain certain type of learning of some behavioral patterns, but maybe not the best way to explain something else. And that's related to the huge complexity of the concept of learning, because it's not one concept. There is a huge area of, or a huge set of different aspects which are connected to that. It has many layers, and that's something.
But you know, Erno, I want to say too that I think, based on what you're saying, we also have to acknowledge that within society, the way we live, the way we are taught, it's very hard for some people to live in the grays. It's very, very hard for some people to understand that true complexity has so many shades and subtleties to it. They cannot live that way. And I see that in what happens in everyday life. They need simple answers. They need clear-cut responses, even if those are false.
Yes, and that it has also something to do with the kind of social psychology of science, so that in order to get the feeling that my work is very important, it is important that I try to show that others, the previous work is not so important anymore, so that I am replacing it now with better ideas and this kind of things. And one consequence is exactly the weak accumulation of knowledge, which in my opinion is extremely serious problem in.
Oh, absolutely. No, that too, and the need to create new terms for what exists.
Yes.
People, there's two things I see all the time in younger researchers, and that's what most of the field is, that the need to create new words for what has existed already. If they knew the literature, if they knew the history, but they don't know their histories. They don't know the roots of their own fields, and that's sad.
Sure, yes, that's true. But then I go to another question, because this pattern thinking and pattern reasoning, this I must say that I like very much that the way how you make the distinction here between the thinking and reasoning, because it really makes sense and is related to many important reasons. For example, this system 1 thinking and system 2 thinking, the immediate reaction and more reflective way to deal with issues. But I think that patterns involved in practically all human activities, so that and many of them really are triggered automatically, so that we not conscious decisions. And this is very much related to one of the topics which we have been discussing many times in different conferences on conceptual change. That this is also a problem that some patterns are so dominating.
True.
They are immediately triggered, and then they are not necessarily the correct patterns to interpret the new phenomena we should learn. And there we really can see the strength of patterns, and the concept of inhibition is there very important. I think that we can inhibit the patterns which are not relevant here, and then maybe apply more complex patterns, which then is more relevant to that.
Yeah, let me react to that, because this whole idea of the figure that I put up came as a result of me trying to navigate the differences in conceptual change literature between the views of Andrei Dusseta, right, and Stella Vazniadu, because one of them is a strongly conceptual-based model, right, where what drives conceptual change is really the conceptual understandings that a person brings, whereas Andy's work is really driven by percept. What it is you're picking up as a result of. And as I said to the two of them, trying to offer a middle point of view, if you will, between those two extremes, is they both are got part of the picture. And that is that true conceptual change. First of all, conceptual change is a natural routine. It shouldn't be treated always, as it is in the sciences, as something terrible to occur. It happens all the time and should be the point is when it can't occur, whereas when you can't get a person to see things differently, that's a different issue. But conceptual change is a natural part of learning and growth in any field. But it requires both of those things working in conjunction, because the world in the sciences, particularly the kind of sciences that Stella and Andy study, like physics, the world the perceptions can mislead. Right? The principle of physics is not what the world seems to suggest to you. So then you have to rethink these percepts, and that's what they both agree on. But they don't ever acknowledge the other. That for so long now they have. Of course, when I presented this to the two of them in the audience, they said, "Oh yeah, we agree. You know, we see that." But that's not what their writings do. Their writings never go into that middle ground. Yeah, well, luckily they both said, yeah, we agree with you when I presented this to them. And yeah, we know that, we agree with that, but that's not the way. Again, it's that false dichotomy, right? It's that need to create two completely opposing views when truth lies in the middle.
Sure. Yes. And, but then coming back to this, the nature of patterns, of course, recently we have been studying that very much in mathematics, and I like very much the studies which our colleague Wim van Doren has made in Leuven about the types of reasoning about mathematical relations. And there is the tendency that when students learn a certain type of reasoning, for example, multiplicative reasoning, then they have a very strong tendency to apply it.
Yeah.
Also, when it is not about about multiplicative reasoning, but additive reasoning, and vice versa. So that's maybe it's a more kind of general tendency for people that when they have noticed something on this reflective level, that okay, yes, that's wonderful. Now I understand the relational, this kind of relational pattern, that they kind of over apply it or over generalize it to different situations.
And that's a natural tendency, exactly what you said. And that's why I think when you present multiplication and I can't say it without flubbing up my words, but when you teach that one principle, you should automatically at a point juxtapose it to another. Do you know what I mean? So then now how is that different from X? Because otherwise they can see the world suddenly through a singular lens, that's dominant lens, if you don't constantly tie it in a comparative sort of way to something else. Now, when would we use this? Or how is this different from that? If you do that, there's at least more of a tendency to see the shades of gray and where that process may apply and where it might not.
Yes, and I think that this is also a problem in typical science classroom, that we typically stop discussing about issues too early, maybe on the level of pattern thinking, so that when the patterns have been noticed, but there's not enough reflection of the patterns, and then not enough comparing where we can apply these patterns and where we can't apply them.
Right. But that really requires teachers to be able to think in the grays, and for teachers to be relational thinkers themselves.
Yes.
And that's also an experience that one can grow in, and that's part of it.
Yes, absolutely. That's what I also have been thinking, that and that this is something which requires new type of thinking of teachers, so that they are not delivering only some material, but they have to be involved in this kind of collective reflection of the content they are teaching.
And constantly threading things back around, constantly bringing key ideas back in relation to something else. We talk about open-mindedness as being a feature of very effective teachers, but it's also this ability to constantly juggle ideas and see them coming together in different sorts of ways. And that's what we want.
Yes, exactly. And you have this nice word, playing with ideas, playing with concepts. This is something that we have now tried to apply in the new ideas of flexible and adaptive mathematical thinking.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Try to very much encourage teachers to support this kind of playing with numbers in mathematical situations. And even we have created some computer games which is all about playing with numbers and numerical relations. And but this is not only in mathematics where this would work, but I really believe that with all but almost everything what we teach at school, there is the opportunity not only to teach a certain concept, but then after we have got some idea of that, then we can start playing with this
That's right.
The relations of things which are related to that.
That's good.
So that's something. Okay, and then the question of, you referred that, and this is the nature of assessment at schools. I think that this is has a kind of key role in because it's, of course, it's natural that people learn what is expected, or they spend most of the time in training something which helps them to take the test or be successful in tests. And if we think the typical questions in science tasks and the other school subjects, there's very seldom anything explicitly about the patterns, the relational patterns, but they are much more kind of repeating only some aspects of the things what they are doing, but very seldom students are asked in assessment to combine what they have recently learned to something what they have learned earlier, or to look more into this more rich relations of things. But have you any ideas how to develop new ideas for assessment which would support thinking,
well, of course I do. In terms of in classrooms, let's talk about teacher-made tests. And one of the things I talk to my students about all the time is, of course, the best thing to do is to pose questions to students that are not simply replications of what it is they've been taught. So that my assessments, even in my large lecture classes, are all what I call application questions. They require you to combine the information that has been taught at different points or under different topics, and to answer the question. It's an open book. I can let them bring their notes. The question requires them to reconceptualize the content toward a problem that itself requires them to compare, contrast, to combine, or to create something unique from that. Now that requires a lot of ability to score those. It takes a lot of training to do those. The other thing, as I said, even if you do multiple choice questions, they should not have a simple keyable response and all else of the options are worthless. That teachers can be taught very simply to create graduated responses, responses that show you variations of what would have led to an error. And math is a very good one for that, because we can figure out in mathematics, for example, what kind of error is likely procedurally that would lead to a certain kind of response. And then even in multiple choice questions, we can look for those in terms of the errors. That's part of it. Part of it is, I think we put too much onus on assessments to begin with. Let's begin with that point. That in the US in particular, they really don't care about the knowledge, they care about the score, back to the behaviorism in practice. So that's why I write a lot about this difference between knowledge building and information management. That the students in the US have been conditioned over the course of their elementary and secondary education to merely figure that the goal is, as a good student, is to get the highest grade. It has nothing to do with the content being of value. And that is a deadening sort of place to be, where what you're hearing in the classroom has no personal value or merit, or will not have after you leave that classroom, that its only value is to get you the highest score. And changing that mentality I can do it to some degree in the class I teach, but whether it permeates is another question. I will tell you, when I first bring this concept up to my students, they get very angry at an educational system that has made them or contributed to that mental perception on their part, that they wasted a lot of their opportunity to become knowledgeable and effective learners for the sake of getting the grade. And they thought they were being good students. They thought they were doing exactly what they were supposed to. And then they realized that in life, nobody's going to give you a grade. That life is all about being able to utilize all that you've learned in a very natural sort of context and situation. And they get very angry at the system, which they should, you know?
Sure. Yes, what you just explained is a very strong conventional pattern in education, in schooling. So that's there we also have it. And sometimes it's very difficult to change these traditional patterns of educational systems, how the social patterns, how they work, what the expectations, in which order things are done, and sometimes it's very frustrating for individual teachers when they got new ideas and try to change it, but then the kind of systemic pattern is so strong that they cannot do it. And even teachers, even students are expecting, the students' expectations are according to the traditional patterns.
That's correct. Now, one of the things you have to be able to show students, to convince them that is to show them that what the value of this knowledge building mentality would be outside in the real world. Many of the college students in a year or 2 years, when I get them, are going to be out in the world, and they're confronted with the inability to think kind of more globally and independently than the system should have created for them. That's part of it. And the other thing is I try to convince them that thinking this way doesn't mean you're not going to get good grades. It doesn't mean that. If you are a knowledge builder by nature, you still can perform extremely well. It's a plus, it's a bonus. But they also think that building knowledge requires more energy and effort than they're willing to give. And as I try to convince them, it's a habit of mind. If you are a knowledge builder by habit, then you are working no more strain or effort than if you are an information manager. And in some ways it becomes easier. Because as you're saying, as you hear something, you constantly are building its relationship to something else, so that knowledge building becomes, you can't avoid it. You can't put it aside. But the educational system from the earliest grades needs to be rethought, because it's actually undermining all the stuff that those of us who are educators really value. What we really want in our students, we're working against it.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you for this wonderful discussion. I would listen to you to the rest of the day.
For days, no.
If I could. Now you can see the questions. What kinds of patterns are particularly salient to our fields of research or subject matter domains? And where and how is relational reasoning addressed in these fields of domains?
Well, I had one thought that popped into my head when I was listening to Erno and Patricia talk, and it was just the ability of the two titans of the field to make all of these relations to different aspects of learning and teaching and instruction, and all of these, and I think that's just so reflective of both of your careers, and it's really something to aspire to, and very inspiring to see you being able to make all of these connections across. And I think it also shows the value and really strong relevance of relational reasoning, relational thinking across all aspects of education and learning and instruction and all of that. So yeah, I want to thank you both for that. And yeah, there's not many of you here left, but we just wanted to note with Minna and Erno as well that this is the first of the last, or the last of the first of the series of ELOC, but we're hoping to continue, or we're planning to continue. So keep an eye out for that in the future. And once again, thank you, Patricia, and thank you, Erno, and thank you, Minna, for a really wonderful session, and thank you to everyone else for joining. So.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Patricia.